do all the work. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Good evening, church. It's nice to see you all. My name is Paul, if I haven't met you. We are almost at the end of Exodus. We've been going, I think it's for 16 weeks already, and we've got the next week the construction of the tabernacle, the week after the consecration, the glory of the Lord appears, and tonight the contributions for the tabernacle. I was challenged this week by a missionary friend who asked me a couple of questions. They said, when we get to heaven, they think God's going to ask us two main questions. And the first main question is this: what did you do with my son? What did you do with Jesus? Did you receive him as your Lord and Savior? Did you serve Jesus? Did you worship Jesus on this earth? That's the most important question. What did you do with my son? But the second question was this: what did you do with my stuff? What did you do with everything I gave you on earth? What did you do with the gifts and the talents that I gave you? What did you do with the money I gave you? What did you do with the time that I gave you? What did you do with all that I blessed you with on this earth? Did you steward it well? I find that second question really confronting. As you know, I love reading biographies. I love reading about generous people. One of my heroes is a woman called Selina, Countess of Huntingdon. You've probably never heard of her. She's this wealthy, aristocratic English lady. She loved Jesus. And she gave and gave and gave her money. She gave her money towards building chapels and theological colleges throughout the UK. In her wealth, she used to hold these lavish dinner parties, fine wine, fine food. She invited all the rich and all the famous to hear Wesley and Whitefield preach the gospel so they could meet Jesus. She was so wealthy, but actually she died almost penniless. A great story how she sold her last pair of pearl earrings to fund one more dinner party so people could hear about Jesus. She was such a generous woman. Or Humphrey of Monmouth, what a great name that is. He almost single-handedly funded the translation of the Bible into English under William Tyndale. So we've got English Bibles because of his generosity. Or a man like Ronald Wilcox, who you've probably never heard of. He was a banker in the UK, an ordinary Christian man who never preached a sermon, never wrote a book, never led a service. But he loved Jesus. And at his funeral, these words were said: Ronald Wilcox could have died a very wealthy man. Think about that. He could have died a very wealthy man, but he chose not to. He chose to use his wealth wisely. And so he bought a building in London to set up a school of preaching. He was so passionate about the word of God being preached well, he bought a building and paid the director to establish a school of preaching, and I benefited from that personally. One day he was walking through Bethnal Green, which is in the East End of London, and he saw these teenagers on the streets. He thought, these teenagers need to hear about Jesus. And so, as you do when you're wealthy, he bought a building. And he established a youth group, which is now a thriving church. He didn't get to benefit from any of that stuff. He just wanted to give. He lived a normal life, drove a normal car, lived in a normal house, wore normal clothes, went on normal holidays, but used his wealth wisely. That's our theme tonight: generosity. What we're going to do with the stuff that God gives us. Jesus said in Matthew 6, verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And basically what he's saying is the way that you use your stuff is like a window into your heart. The way that you use your money will reveal what you really love in life. And no one's going to disagree with that, are they? Like, if you love fitness, you spend your money on gym membership. If you love entertainment, you spend your money on concerts and movies and theatres. And if you love education, you spend your money on your child's education. If you love church, love Jesus, you give your money to church. Where your treasure is, your heart is there also. So tonight we are going to talk about generosity, and we'll talk about money. And I know that's awkward. I know that's a bit sensitive. And if you're new here, we rarely talk about money. We haven't talked about money for 5 years. But I don't understand why, because the Bible talks about money lots. You know, Paul set up the first tear fund, and Peter set up a charity for widows. And did you know that 17 of the 38 parables that Jesus told are about money or possessions? Jesus thinks it's important, and so should we. So in Exodus chapter 35, open your Bibles to Exodus 35, and we are building a tabernacle. God's people are invited to be part of building a tabernacle, that place where God is going to dwell amongst his people, that place where the Ark of the Covenant is going to live, that place where the people of God go to sacrifice to the Lord and to worship the Lord. It's this beautiful, precise, stunning tabernacle with gold, silver, tapestries, carved wood, incense, and God invites the people to be part of it. I've got 5 short points tonight. Here's the first one. Grace-driven generosity. Grace-driven generosity, because our generosity flows out of your personal relationship with God. When you've met Jesus and been gripped by his grace and by his generosity towards you, it's like you had this heart change that you want to give, you long to give. I find the first 3 verses of chapter 35 just bizarre and fascinating and interesting. Because before Moses tells the people to build the tabernacle, he tells them to Sabbath. You spot that? Before they work for the Lord, they've got to rest in the Lord. Loads of work to be done for God, but before you do that, make sure that you remember who you are in God first. Verse 6, for 6 days work is to be done, but the 7th day shall be your holy day, a day of Sabbath rest to the Lord. He's basically saying, remember who you are. Remember you are creatures, and God is your creator, and he rested, and so must you. Remember that God's your redeemer. He redeemed you, so remember that your identity is in God. God is going to care for you. God is going to provide for you. So stop, rest, and rejoice in God. That declaration that God is God and we're just his creatures and we get to be involved in his work. Remember, Jesus said, come to me if you're weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. So our rest, our purpose, our peace is in Jesus. And that's the only posture for generosity. Grace. Because anything we do for the Lord must flow out of our rest in the Lord. Before we ever do anything for God, make sure your heart is right with God. It is not work for the Lord, give to the Lord, and you'll find rest in the Lord. It's the wrong way around. You find your rest in the Lord, you find your peace in Jesus, your purpose in Jesus, and when you've got that, you want to give. That is so important. It reminds me of that little short man, Zacchaeus. I can call him little short because the Bible calls him little and short. That little man called Zacchaeus who met Jesus. And he had his life radically transformed, didn't he? Once he'd encountered Jesus, he said, if I've wronged somebody, I will pay them back fourfold. And tonight I give away half my possessions to the poor. Imagine that. Not 10%, not 20%, but half, 50%. I'm going to give it away. Because he'd encountered Jesus. And when you've encountered Jesus, it's not what must I give or what must I serve, it's what do I get to give and get to serve. See the difference? It's like the Macedonians that Paul used as a kind of an example for the Corinthian church. So the Corinthians were rich, they were wealthy, they lived lavish lifestyles, nice houses, but they were stingy. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, now brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of very severe trial, their overflowing joy, that's joy in Jesus, and their extreme poverty, so they were poor financially. It welled up in rich generosity. They gave. I testify they gave as much as they were able, even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of giving. Isn't that amazing? They gave themselves first to the Lord. That's the key. They gave themselves to Jesus. And once they'd done that, they just wanted to give and keep on giving. I spent some time in Thailand about 30 years ago. I worked in an orphanage just for 3 months. In this one little mud hut, and almost every single day, a Christian would knock on my door, offering me a meal, a plate of food. They had nothing, but they wanted to give because they loved Jesus. That's the only attitude for giving. Because if your generosity is a response to guilt or duty, you'll be asking questions like, come on, Paul, tell me, what's the dollar sign? How much must I give? Or, yes, sure, put me on that roster, but your heart won't be in it. But if you've met Jesus, gripped by his grace, you just get to give, you want to give. Remember that woman who walked into Jesus and she washed his feet with her tears and wiped his feet with her hair. Then she broke that really expensive perfume jar. Remember that story? And the rich Pharisees are just tut-tutting. This is outrageous. What a waste of money that is. And Jesus said, you haven't got it. She loves me so much. She's been forgiven much. She wants to express her gratitude. So please, would your generosity flow from the love you have for Jesus? And number 2, it's God-honoring generosity. So God decides what his tabernacle should look like. It's his tabernacle, not ours. It's his church, not our church. We get to be part of it. Verse 4 says, Moses said to the whole Israelite community, this is what the Lord has commanded. So it's not Moses' building project. It's not the elders getting together with a strategic plan for a tabernacle. Moses just does what God commanded him to do. And God commanded the people to contribute to this work according to his will. Verse 5 is an important verse. From what you have, or literally from what the Lord has given you, take an offering for the Lord. From what the Lord has given you, take an offering and give it back to the Lord. And what verse 5 is saying is that everything we have comes from God. We're just stewards, we're not owners. And so we give it back to the Lord. You might see in the 7 p.m. service that after the collection is taken, they bring it down the front and I pray over it. I often pray the prayer from the prayer book, which says, all things come from you, O Lord, and of your own have we given you. It all belongs to you, we're just giving back to you, God. That's the attitude. But God is so particular. A quarter of Exodus is spent on this tabernacle. It's detailed, it's precise. It's like the most well-planned building project ever. There's an Excel spreadsheet where you can sign up to bring yarn, or you can bring a gem, or you can bring some incense. Just sign up, he says. And it's detailed and precise because this building is for the Lord. The tabernacle was supposed to honor God, magnify God, make God look so spectacular. It was not about the Israelites, it was about God. And I want to say, church is not about you, it's about God. Please, could we never, ever have a plaque in this church saying this chair belongs to Mr. X who gave $500. Or this piano was sponsored by Mrs. Y. That is the most ridiculous thing. Please, in this church, no sort of tiered levels of giving, the gold standard, the silver, the bronze level. That's the way the world gives. That's not the church. But God is very precise about what his church should look like, isn't he? He doesn't give us a layout for what each building needs to look like, but he does say that a church must be built on Jesus Christ. And he does say that the people who pastor in church is about their character, not just their competency. It's about their godliness, not their charisma. And he's very clear on the purpose of church, to gather God's people, to edify, to preach the gospel, to help the poor and the needy. And he invites you and I to be part of building his church. So the tabernacle needed resources, needed materials, needed money. Verses 5 to 9 is basically like their money system. Some brought gold, verse 5, some brought silver, some brought bronze. Some, verse 6, brought blue, purple, scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, wood, olive oil, spices. They brought their goods. They brought their resources for the temple. But it's not just treasure, it's their talents as well. It's not just the resources, you need skills. You've got to take these raw materials of gold, silver, and yarn and create something from it. Love verse 10, all who are skilled among you are to come and make everything the Lord has commanded. God doesn't just want your treasure, he wants your talents. And so these people came and they made the tabernacle with clasps and frames and crossbows. They made curtains, they made lamps, they made an altar for incense, they made the doorways, they made the altar for the burnt offering, they made the poles, they made the courtyard. Woven garments for the priests to wear. And these two blokes, Bezalel and Oholiab, see them down in verse 31? Bezalel was filled with the Spirit of God. So the Spirit of God anointed this man with these gifts of wisdom and understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills. And Bezalel was kind of a creative person. He had artistic design skills for working gold and silver and bronze. He cut and set stones in wood, and he made this temple so beautiful. And I'm so thankful for people who have that skill of creativity. Let me say right at first, I do not have that skill. You know, there's people who walk into a room and go, yep, you should paint this room the off-white colour. I don't have that skill. Or the people who just, they chuck a rug somewhere and it just looks amazing. I chuck a rug, it looks rubbish. Or the person who says, you should put a candle in this space and that particular fragrance. That is a gift from the Lord. And the point is that the Spirit of God gifts every individual with particular talents and particular skills. And we get to use those gifts for the building of God's church. I'm so thankful for all those who serve so generously in this church. For those with a gift of worship and music and sound and video stuff, for those with a gift of creativity and artistic design, for those with a gift of spreadsheets and the legal brain for policies and procedures, for those with the gifts of recording, for those of doing kids' church and creche and youth ministry, for those with the gift of prayer, for those with the gift who just want to sit with somebody and pray with them and cry with them. I'm so thankful for the way you use your gifts for the building of God's church, because we cannot build God's church unless every individual uses their gift. Maybe tonight you go home and say, okay, Spirit of God, what gifts have you given me? And how might I use them for the building up of your church? It's not just money, it's your talents. But please remember that God does not need you. I mean, God could have created this tabernacle just by clicking his fingers. But he invited the Israel to play their part in it. Same with us. God doesn't need us to build his church. God could snap his fingers and plant a church in every suburb in Sydney and every suburb around this city, around this world. But the way that God works is he uses us and invites us to contribute the planting of churches across this city. And why does God do that? Because when you are generous, it changes you. When you're generous with your time, your talents, and your treasure, it changes you. You begin to say, how can I please God? What can I give God? How can I make God big? But please seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, not your own. I do fear that God sometimes gets the leftovers. We seek our own needs first, we build our own houses first, and then we give what's left over to the Lord. That's the wrong way around. And we can be quite selfish, in our giving. It's fascinating pastoring a church, especially with kids. Like once your kids get to a certain age, you suddenly become passionate about youth ministry. And you want to fund youth ministry in church, and then you want to fund young adult ministry, and then you want to fund old age ministry. And suddenly, when it benefits you, you want that ministry to be funded. But actually, that's just selfish, isn't it? Do you think the people who paid for this extraordinary building 125 years ago were thinking about themselves? They were thinking about people like you and I who would sit in this building 125 years later hearing the gospel. And what struck me as well is that this tabernacle is just beautiful. Can you picture it? Scarlet, purple, blue, gemstones, onyx, gold, silver, bronze, incense, candles. Just beautiful, because God deserves the best, doesn't he? It's not IKEA or fantastic furniture. It's the most intricate, stunningly beautiful materials for our God. Because when people see the tabernacle, they should say, wow, their God is amazing. And I know that we've been scarred by history of churches just spending crazy amounts of money on gold and marble and ornate building. I'm not talking about that. But church buildings still need to be honoring to God, don't they? The state of our building reflects our attitude towards the God that we serve. So it's grace-driven, it's God-honoring. This is the biggie. It's a willing generosity. We give because we're moved to give, not because we're manipulated to give. The repeated word in this chapter is the word willing. Look at it with me, verse 5. Everyone who is willing to bring to the Lord an offering. Down to verse 22. All who were willing, men and women alike, came and brought their gifts. Down to verse 26. All the women who were willing and had the skill spun their goat hair. That attitude of willingness, volunteering it, not being coerced into it. Verse 20 is the key verse, really. The whole community withdrew from Moses' presence. And everyone who was willing and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to the Lord for the work of the tent of meeting. I just love that verse. Because Moses has said, okay, here we go. This is the vision. This is the strategy. This is the building project. Now it's time to build. We need your gifts. We need your money. Now go home. Go home from my presence. Pray about it. Inquire of the Lord of it. Think about it. Ask God what he's asking you to contribute. I love that. There's no arm twisting, no manipulation, no coercion, no guilt tripping. Moses does not preach a sermon series on tithing. Moses doesn't keep the people there until they've reached their targets and pass the bags around one more time, one more time, one more time. There's no slick stewardship campaign with dim lighting and pads on the keys. There's no tug at your heart's video of some sob story of some girl who's been helped by your giving. There's no pledge cards where you seize the moment. And no comparison saying, well, this campus gave $50,000 to try and beat that. He just says, here's the need. Here's what God asked, now go home. Pray about it. And if you're willing, then bring an offering. I love that. Because if we manipulate people to give, they will give out of guilt, they give out of duty, but not out of gratitude. It's a simple vision casting. This is the plan. These are the needs. This is what God has asked. Take time by yourself, just you and God. You decide how much you want to give. Look down to verse 29. All the Israelites, men and women who were willing, brought to the Lord, look at that word, free will offerings. That's an important word. It's not arm-twisted offerings or manipulated offerings, but it's free will offerings, voluntary, heartfelt giving back to God. It's 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7. Each of you should give what you have decided to give in your heart. What you have decided between you and God. That is the only way to do kingdom work. Tell people what the needs are. Tell people what the money's going to be used for, why you need it, and go away and pray about it. I tried to do that last week at our vision night. It was an amazing night last Thursday. Where I set the vision for the next 3 years of the Bridge Church. You know, I hinted at a fourth location. You now know that's Roselle. Praise God for that. But that's going to cost us money. I launched on that vision night what I'm calling the Bridge Network, which is basically how we as a church can give away to other churches. How we can fund workers, a youth worker or a student minister at churches who could not afford that. But we can. Let's bless them with that. Or share our resources, share our kids' resources, our music resources, our mission resources. Let's give away to be part of this network where we love them, support them, and champion them and say, we're going to bless you. I'm excited by that, but that costs money. I also launched what I call the School of Ministry, which is a program for gap years and for interns and for pastors in training and for older folk just to be equipped and sent out as gospel workers. And on that night, I had so many people come up to me and email me afterwards and say, Paul, why didn't you ask for money? You didn't mention money. I was like, oh yeah, that was deliberate. Because I want people to catch the vision before they give. I want people to be so excited by what God could do and might do before they're asked to give. Yeah, we're trying to raise $1 million. Let's not be ashamed about that. But I don't want to manipulate anybody to give. I want you to say, I want to give to this because I'm excited by it. Does that make sense? So grace-driven, God-honoring, willing giving. And number 4, every member generosity. Everyone gets to be part of it. Verse 5 again, everyone who is willing. Verse 10, all who are skilled. Down to verse 21, everyone who was willing. Or again, verse 22, all who are willing, men and women alike. He's saying everybody can play your part. Young, old, rich, poor, men, women, boys and girls, you all got a part to play. Some, verse 22, came and brought gold jewelry of all kinds. Brooches, earrings, rings and ornaments. And if you know Exodus, this is all the stuff that the Egyptians gave the Israelites when they left Egypt. Remember they said, here, get out of here, quickly, take it. And then they're giving back to God from what God has blessed them with. That is the principle. What God has given you, you give back to him. Not everyone had gold or silver. Some people, verse 23, had blue, purple, and scarlet yarn. That was their gift. Some people had goat hair, ram skins. Others had leather. Some gave candles, some gave incense, some gave wood. The point is this. Everybody gave something. Everyone got involved. Now, yes, some people gave very, very expensive items. Gold, silver, onyx, and gemstones. They were costly. But some people in the church had the resources to bring those things. Other people didn't. But they could still bring something. Some brought goat's hair. Do you spot that? Goat's hair. That doesn't cost very much. I can't imagine that was too expensive. Or a few spices. That's all they had. But the principle is that they gave out of what they had. And so those with more means were expected to contribute more. Someone said it's not equal gifts, it's equal sacrifice. Not equal gifts, equal sacrifice. They didn't all give the same dollar amount, but they gave according to what they'd been given by God. Remember the story that Jesus told in Luke chapter 21? It says this, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple's treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. And Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Then that widow, she gave less, far less, financially than the wealthy people. But she actually gave far more because it was more costly for her. That's the principle. And that's one of the problems I do have with the tithing principle, because 10% is a nice amount. But for some people, it's nothing. You know, you tell me you earn $2 million per year and you give 10%, and oh, poor you, you've got to live on $1.8 million this year. Now, you could give 40% and not feel the ouch factor. But for others, 10% is a massive sacrifice. Listen very carefully. God is not after the resources of a few wealthy people in his church. He wants the hearts of every person in this church. I like to imagine Jesus smiling as the widow came to give her coins, and the widow smiling as she gave her 2 coins. Or the Macedonians smiling as they gave and gave and gave again. I find this liberating because if you haven't got much, and there are people here tonight who haven't got very much, you might be thinking, oh, there's no point in me giving. What's my $50 going to do compared to $10,000? You've missed the point. Doesn't matter what you give, it's your heart, and you get to be part of God's work. But it's challenging, this chapter, for those of us who have much. Do you ever stop and ask, why has God given me so much? It's not to buy more toys or to cruise in retirement. It's not to be more comfortable or send your kids to bigger and better schools. It's to be more generous. And here's my general observation, but I think it's true. Those who have the most in Sydney are often the least generous. Those people I know who have very little, they've almost cultivated this daily dependency on the Lord. Like my father owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. My father provided yesterday, he'll provide tomorrow. And they sit really loosely with what God has given them. And they're so generous. I'm very thankful for my wife, who basically says, anything that we get in, we just give out. But those who have much, it's like we are slaves to materialism. We just keep on increasing our standard of living. Randy Alcorn says this: God's extra provision is not usually intended to raise your standard of living, but to raise your standard of giving. It's not a bigger barn to store more stuff in, but bigger hands of generosity. Or Philip Ryken says, those of us who have the most should give the most. This is why God made you rich. So you have more money to use for ministry. As our income rises, so should your commitment to make more and more costly sacrifices for the kingdom of God. One of my heroes is John Wesley. If you know his story, as his income increased year after year after year, his standard of living did not increase. He just gave more away. He says, money never stays with me. It would burn me if it did. I throw it out of my hands as soon as possible, lest it should find a way into my heart. Or the Sydney man who was speaking to a famous preacher and said, I hope God makes me rich so I can be generous someday. And the preacher said, well, can God trust you with your money today? Are you generous with your money today? Because if you're not generous now, you won't be generous then. So grace-given, God-honouring, willing every member, and lastly, abundant generosity. Because chapter 36, verses 2 to 7 are just ridiculous, crazy verses. The people basically say, we want to give and give and give and give and give again. See that verse 3? 36 verse 3, and the people continue to bring freewill offerings morning after morning. And this is not different people, it's the same people. That's the context of that verse. The same people every day saying, here's some more, here's some more, here's some more, want to give, 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 and give again. And so verse 4, all the skilled workers who were doing all the work on the sanctuary, they stopped what they were doing and they said to Moses, the people are bringing more than enough. We've got more than enough. Isn't that a great phrase? I love that phrase, more than enough. Because that's the nature of our God, more than enough. Our God gives us more than enough grace and more than enough forgiveness and more than enough blessings. And the people gave more than enough. And then Moses does in verse 6 what I don't believe any pastor has ever done. He stands up and says, church, please stop giving. We've got more than enough, please stop. Isn't that amazing? I love Moses' integrity at this point. Moses did not look at all this stuff coming in and have a word from the Lord to build a bigger tabernacle. Or he didn't have a word of prophecy to go and build his own personal spiritual retreat in the mountains with the extra money. He just says, stop. We've got enough. That is good leadership. That's actually one of the reasons why this network is starting, because we have got enough here. Let's start to give away, shall we? But imagine if you hadn't yet given to the tabernacle. And you thought, okay, today's the day I'm going to take my gift to the tabernacle. And you turned up at the tabernacle with your gift, and Moses says, sorry, we don't need your gift. I hope you feel gutted and disappointed because you'd waited too long to give. I held on to it for too long and I missed out on being part of the God's work. I really want to be part of that. Let me speak very bluntly as I close. Most of us here can afford to give away so much more. I'm not just talking about money, but your money, your time, and your talents. To the church, to missionaries, to aid organizations, to individuals. There's so much gospel work that we could do. But you must be motivated by grace. You must just fall more in love with Jesus. When you fall more in love with Jesus, you want to give. God does not want your money if he hasn't got your heart. God doesn't want your time if he hasn't got your heart. God doesn't want your talent if you haven't got your heart. And you've got to believe it's really more blessed to give than to receive. It really is. Michael Green says, as we give generously, we are liberated from bondage to materialism. And the Lord is liberated to do things in and through us. God will bless the generous giver with enough for their needs. And God will multiply their resources for good works. It really is more blessed to give than to receive. So let me ask you the two questions the missionary challenged me with. What are you doing with God's Son? What are you doing with him? Are you delighting him, loving him, receiving him, serving him, worshipping him? And then what are you doing with God's stuff? What are you doing with all the stuff he gives you? Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the many ways that you have blessed us. We thank you for your grace that you have bestowed upon us, for your extraordinary generosity towards us in the person of Jesus. Help us, Lord, please, to be generous with our time. In whatever season of life we find ourselves in today, help us to give to others. Help us to be generous with the talents, the gifts, the skills you've given us. Help us just not to use them for other purposes, but help us to give them to your work, to your kingdom. And Father, for the different incomes in this room, I want to say thank you for blessing us with money. Please help us to be sacrificial and generous to those in need.